Hi, my name is Casey Killow, and this is my research presentation on healthcare professionals and their lifestyle coping activities. My research was done to explore the adverse working conditions and how they can impact longevity and quality of a career. The specific focus was on healthcare workers and direct care workers, with the research question being what lifestyle coping activity is the most effective at managing and avoiding emotional and physical burnout in healthcare workers. I think healthcare workers and direct care workers play a really vital role in our community with their responsibility of caring for our loved ones. So they can have a really significant and positive impact on the lives of the patients and the clients that they care for, but it can be at the expense of their emotional, physical, mental well-being. A lot of times there's pretty extreme working conditions, especially after everything that we've been through in the last couple of years with COVID. The healthcare industry has really taken a hit between being short-staffed and just the nature of the job that they do. So the data that I collected in this research project was aimed at the many ways that healthcare providers can manage and deal with the potential emotional burnout that can happen from the job that we do. So some of the research that I did leading up to this was through the literature review that we did. The three different articles that I reviewed were the impact of caring for patients with severe and complex disabilities. This study examined healthcare workers' quality of life. Another article was the association between occupational and leisure time physical activity with employee stress, burnout, and well-being. And the final one was on workplace burnout and health issues among correctional officers. The first article studied the determinants of the quality of life in direct care workers who are caring for individuals with severe and complex difficulties. So this was exploring the lifestyle of people who worked in direct care in pretty rough situations with people who required a lot, with patients who required a lot of care, having severe and complex difficulties functioning day to day. The aim of this study was to determine the quality of life of healthcare workers. And some of those determinants for the healthcare workers are their age, their financial difficulties, the nature of coping strategy, and burnout. So these are the different things that they looked at. The independent variable of this study was the different elements of life, and the dependent variable was the quality of life dimension score. So they took all of these aspects of the quality of life of these healthcare workers and created a score out of a series of self-report studies, and used that to apply it to the different elements of their life as well as the job. This study offered a lot of framework for my study because it really kind of made me think about how I was going to apply the different elements of how healthcare workers use different parts of their life or how that can impact their job and how they come out of their job emotionally and physically. The second article talked a lot about physical activity, and this was important for me because one of my lifestyle coping skills that I go over and coping activities that I explore with healthcare professionals is physical activity. So this article was great for me to read about the differences in how physical activity can impact stress management. This article specifically looked at workplace physical activity compared to leisure time activity, and measured the associations between how you having occupational activity versus having leisure time activity and how that can impact stress, burnout among specifically healthcare workers. All of these were healthcare direct care. This study used a couple of different scales, like self-report scales to measure the impact of stress and burnout. Again, most of these articles that I reviewed use some kind of scale and like self-report inventory to create a score to then apply to the correlational studies that they did. The results showed that physical activity was found to be significantly and positively associated with employee well-being. There were some specifics about what type of physical activity. There was a negative impact if it was an overwhelming amount of workplace physical activity versus just leisure time. But this really kind of got my brain thinking about how I could apply and gather information on physical activity and different ways of managing stress, and how some of them just happen without us even realizing it because it's a part of the job. And then the third article was specific to correctional officers, which is not necessarily directly healthcare or direct care, but in this circumstance, I think it really applies because they are still working and responsible for the well-being physically, sometimes emotionally, of their population. So that's just like healthcare workers, or specifically the field that I'm in is in mental health care, like a residential direct care capacity. I think it's very similar, and there are a lot of connections to the adverse working conditions. So this article discussed just that, the conditions that these correctional officers were experiencing day to day and how they might enhance the occurrence of negative psychological states. So there were a bunch of self-report, again, studies and inventories that they compiled along with different lifestyle choices. And then they took that information and applied it to their scores from these inventories. So these articles were all really great for me for structuring how I put together my survey and how I was going to look at the data that I collected. Some of the things that I pulled from, and like I said, there are a lot of self-report studies to use, and I think a lot of that comes from the lasting impacts of COVID that we've had on the healthcare industry and that we've had on just the overall conversation on mental health, and how we perceive stress and how we measure that. It's no longer just you're super busy and you're worn out and you're stressed out. We have actual measurable ways to kind of apply that. And so some of the different scales that were used in these articles and that I also used for inspiration include, a big one is the Maslach burnout inventory. It's a couple slides down. That one was cited in all three articles. That seems to be a pretty common inventory used to measure workplace burnout. And then I pulled pieces from the different inventories that I have here. The Oldenburg burnout inventory, the perceived stress scale. All of these really helped when I was thinking about how I wanted to ask questions and what I wanted to focus on. So my research was 30 participants. All of them were healthcare and direct care workers. I used a Qualtrics survey that I posted to social media. I also supplemented with some of my coworkers. So a little bit more than half came from social media, and then the rest came from the coworkers that I work with. As I said before, I work in mental health. I work at a residential facility with children. I didn't want to just reach out to my coworkers because I wanted it to be a little bit more varied, as far as levels of education go, as far as what we were doing in healthcare. So I ended up getting a lot of nurses, a couple of different physicians, a couple of different specialties involved. So I really wanted to get a good variety of who I was pulling information from. So they were just then divided into subgroups based on their occupation, their level of education, and their years at that current occupation. Again, the intention was to gather and have a variety of people that were reporting on this information. I think if you get just one population from one company, you run the risk of having it be biased based on things that don't actually have to do with the job and have more to do with the company that you're pulling from. So I had 31 questions in total. Like I said, I broke it down into demographics that included current occupation, the years that they were at that occupation, their level of education, and then I had the other variable that I was working with, which was the lifestyle coping activities, is what I called it. And I asked for them to report how many hours a week they dedicate to each of those things. So I broke it into physical activity, social interactions, and creative expression. Those are the three main categories that I think people intentionally put effort into when it comes to intentionally trying to self-soothe or self-care or all the things that they tell us are healthy for us, to use those things to apply to their mental health and well-being. So I used a Likert scale for most of my questions. It was never, almost never, sometimes, often, and very often. Some examples of the questions that I asked were, everyday challenges from my profession impact my overall mood and well-being. The participant would then score never, almost never, sometimes, often, very often. I accomplished many worthwhile things in this job, and by the end of the week, I feel I have accomplished the things that I set out to accomplish at the start of the week. some of the questions, the way that I organized it was in 3 different categories that kind of covered, and I got this from a lot of the other self-report surveys that I read through. They seem to all be categorized into a couple of different subgroups, and I chose stress, like overall stress, job satisfaction, and growth. So after I got all of my data and went through all of the questions, I then broke them into 3 different categories so I could create an overall score. So based on their answers, how did they score based on overall stress, their job satisfaction? A lot of the questions asked, I'm looking to further education in this job to continue to grow in my career, or growth. The growth category also included some questions about their personal life, about how they manage their personal life. So I tried to cover everything that included the whole picture of mental health and how we manage that. So from there, I have some results. I have everything broken up, the demographics. This is covering my results from occupation. So I have the percentages on the feedback that I got from the participants and how I kind of split it into subgroups. Thankfully, it was pretty even, but as expected, I kind of expected it to lean towards nursing and mental health care. I think going forward, I might even combine that and just create bigger subgroups for this for some of my correlational data that I'm going to run. But as you see here, a lot of who I got was nurses, mental health care. The other category, it was a lot of mental health. For example, it was clinicians, it was ABAs. So that other category was a little ambiguous, and I think if I were to do it again, I wouldn't leave it so ambiguous because it was a lot of overlap. I have demographics on the level of education. This is the percentages that were the level of education. Master's degree, bachelor's degree, those tend to be the most common. I had a couple of people who came in with a high school degree, a diploma, associate's degree is pretty common. So it's kind of the full spread on level of education. And then I moved into frequency. For here, I have some charts on frequency. So this is where I started to really look at the frequency of the coping activity that they used, and then moving forward, I'll do more data on how those physical activities correspond to those coping activities correspond to their level of stress and what they scored on stress, personal growth, job satisfaction, all of that. So we have the majority in 0 hours of physical activity were reported. And then from there, from 2, 4, 6, 8 hours, it's pretty spread out, but it looks like the majority of people are in the 2-hour range, outside of people who aren't physically active, who reported that they are not physically active. Same thing with social interactions. We're in about the 2-hour range, also shared with the 8+ hour range, which was interesting data that I didn't expect. But this is also a category that you could fit a lot into. This includes family. This includes going out with friends for drinks. This could include physical activity, going and playing softball. So this was a little bit more ambiguous. But again, everybody kind of reports some attention put to social interactions. And then we also have a creative expression. Less people than I thought contributing 8+ hours a week to it. A lot of people, half the people that reported said they don't put any time into creative expression. So that was interesting. I didn't quite expect it to be so definitive in the no. Here are my descriptive statistics. This is the mean, standard deviation, and variance on each of the different categories of coping activities. Also the different scores. So we have the physical activity here. The mean is at 2.31. Because of how the data that I collected was numeric, 2.31 is in between 2 hours and 4 hours. Same with the social interactions and creative expression, because those are all based off of hours. And then we have our stress score, job satisfaction score, and growth score. Each one of those had an equal amount of questions that were dedicated to those scores. So it's pretty even across the board with where those means and stuff come from, that information comes from. And then I have my cross tabulations that I'm going to continue to do to finish off my data for the research paper and get a full picture of this. But these next 3 slides are just going to be the examples of how I would do cross tabulation between physical activity and then the stress score. So in here you see the stress score is going to tell you how, depending on how many hours of physical activity, that's going to tell you how they reported their stress levels. Surprisingly, the more physical activity there were, the higher the stress score was. I didn't expect that. My hypothesis was kind of the more people devote to physical activity, they'll reap the benefits of that with their stress levels. But the data showed me a little differently. It kind of ranged to 0 hours. The stress score did peak for some people, but there was also right in the middle. It seems like there's kind of a sweet spot in that 2-hour range where the lowest stress scores are in kind of the middle ranges. Same with job satisfaction. However, there is this one outlier here. It's hard to see in the slide right now, but there are some outliers with the data, but everything across the board, this doesn't really seem too conclusive with job satisfaction. And then growth score as well. And this is kind of personal growth. This included questions like, I feel like I can progress in my career. I feel that I am good at what I do. I feel like I can grow in what I'm doing. So that's kind of where that came from. And those are the scores for that. Like I said, I'm going to continue. The additional research that I'm going to put in is going to be the same cross tabulation data that I did, but for the other 2 lifestyle coping activities. Reverse codes were done on all of my Likert scale questions so that I could get those scores together. So any question that had a negative implication, I did a reverse code for it so that the higher strongly agree or happens all the time was actually a negative and not it incorporated as a positive. So that allowed me to get those scores. And then further analysis will be done on the correlation between the different occupations and the scores based on my Likert scale questions. So I hope you enjoyed the research that I have gathered. I think this is a really important topic. I think if anybody taking this class probably has some interest in psychology and some interest in the health field, maybe not, but it's hugely important that as we move forward in this field and in this industry that we're looking at the whole picture and making sure that we're not just workhorses and martyrs, putting all of our time. And I think this data that's being collected on how to balance that scale is going to be really, really critical for us moving forward in our success. So I hope you enjoyed my research. Thank you.